Hi. So, over the last 10 weeks or so, we have been discussing the various forces that affect the evolution of populations. And all the concepts and everything that we discussed forms the so called modern synthesis or its more modern cousin, the extended evolutionary synthesis. However, all these things that we discussed, they start with the assumption that life is there. It's a given. It has all these properties, variation, inheritance and so on. And now how things are changing. However, none of these discuss the core question in biology, so to speak, which is how exactly did life originate? And this, again, one of the big questions in biology, this is what we are going to discuss today and in the next discussion. But before we do that, we first need to come up with some kind of a definition of life. And as all of you are aware, that is a very, very hard task. Honestly, there is no consensus definition that everybody agrees on. And therefore, there was a 2011 study which actually analyzed some 123 different definitions of life and came up with, life is a metabolizing material informational system with the ability of self reproduction with changes, evolution, which requires energy and suitable environment. As you can see, it's a very clunky kind of a definition. It doesn't give you, insights straight away. And to be fair to the author, Ian Trifonov, he didn't really, propose this as the definition of life. They simply said that, look, after looking at these 123 definitions and essentially taking out all the words that are composing those definitions, it looks like these are the major words, that or major concepts that people think should be a part of the definition of life. And if I combine these various concepts, this is one of the ways to do that. That's about it. Ian Trifonov doesn't really say that this is the best way of doing it. But as I said, this definition doesn't really lead us anywhere. So what we will do is we will use a much simpler and often quoted definition that ascribed to NASA, which says that life is a self-sustaining chemical system capable of Darwinian evolution. Now, what are the implications of this definition? We'll see that in a few minutes. But before that, what are the various theories of origin of life? Of course, you have the supernatural theories of life that some deity made living organisms and hence life. Now, being a supernatural theory, we cannot really subject this to scientific investigation. However, note that we have already dealt with the various arguments against creationism, and since creationism doesn't differentiate between origin of life and evolution of life, therefore all the arguments that we made against creationism, all of that is also going to work over here. So once we have that out of the way, let's look at the various natural theories of life. And the first and the perhaps the most ancient theory of how life originated dates back to Aristotle, who essentially said that life could arise from non-living matter. And this by and large made sense because people all the time saw maggots coming out from rotten fruits, or they saw insects and other things arising seemingly out of nowhere. And therefore people took this very seriously, and this remained the dominant view till about 16th century. And people did all kinds of things. So for example, there is this very famous Dutch chemist Jean Baptiste van Helmont, who actually ended up giving a recipe for how to create a mice. So he basically said, take some hay and put it in some dirty cloth and keep it outside, and after about 21 days you are going to get mice coming out of it. Looks like he also studied it, when if you look at his notes, looks like he tried doing this experiment. However, all this somehow got very strongly challenged in the 17th century, and there were multiple experiments which were done to show that whether this works or not. And the first and the most famous of these was done by this person, Francesco Redi. So, Francesco Redi was an Italian scientist and poet, and is referred to as the founder of experimental biology as well as the founder of modern parasitology. Has done a lot of work, but the most, perhaps what he is most remembered for, at least in the field of evolution, is related to his work on spontaneous generation. So, what did he do? So, at that point of time, it was believed that maggots rose from dead meat spontaneously. But Reddy thought that that's not really correct. They probably rose from other flies. So what he did over here was took pieces of meat and put them under three conditions. So in the first condition, he put it in a jar and then sealed it. In the second condition, he put it in a jar but covered it with fine cloth, extremely fine cloth. And in the third case, he put it in a jar but didn't cover it, just kept it that way. Now, why exactly did he, do the second treatment? That will become clear in a moment. And then he left the meat to rot for several days and found as follows. So, when the meat was in a sealed jar, as in the first one on the left, then no maggots arose, although the meat did rot. When the meat was kept in an open jar, then the maggots and then flies came out of that treatment. Now, these two were the early experiments that Reddy had done, and then people commented that in the sealed jar you also do not have any air. Okay, airflow is blocked. So maybe life does arise spontaneously, but it requires air. In the absence of air, it will not happen. And that is where, in a subsequent experiment, which is what I am showing you, the third middle treatment came in, where he put extremely fine cloth, which didn't allow the flies to go inside, but allowed air to go in and out. And even in this particular case, he ended up seeing that there was no maggots coming out of the meat, although there were some maggots which first very small maggots which were seen on the top. So based on this, Reddy came to the conclusion that look, flies could access over here. In the third one, maggots arose. In these two cases, flies could not access, which is why there were no maggots, and therefore he came to the conclusion that omne vivum ex vivo, all life arise from pre-existing life. In other words, there is no spontaneous generation. Now, this was a pretty nicely done, conclusive kind of an experiment. There were a few other experiments of this type, but in spite of all these, the scientific world did not really abandon the idea of spontaneous generation until this person. So this is Louis Pasteur, and as we know, he played a very important role in the development of modern microbiology. So for example, when you look at your milk packet in the morning, very often you will see on it is written pasteurized, and that is the process by which you kill all the microorganisms in the milk, and that's how the milk stays for long, and for that we have this man to thank. Now, what Pasteur did, around the time, he was obviously late 19th century, so his around mid 19th century, 1850s or so, the French Academy launched a competition to validate or negate whatever the theory of spontaneous generation. And Pasteur took part in that competition, and he designed his very famous experiment using these kind of flasks, what are known as swan-necked flasks. So what Pasteur did was, he put some liquid which he knew was fermentable, meant that microorganisms could grow in them, and then he boiled the liquid. And the structure of this flask was such that when you are boiling, then the vapor is going to be pushed through this, and it's going to escape through here, this part. But once the vapor has escaped, in some of the treatments he sealed it, and in some of the treatments he just kept it like that. But what happens is, once the vapor has escaped, then if there is air or anything coming from this side, then that essentially gets blocked over here, okay, or at least the things that are there in the air, the particulate matters, they settle in this part of the neck, the swan neck, so to speak. And this is very, very crucial for this experiment, as I am going to show you in a minute. So what Pasteur did was, he took these flasks, boiled his fermentable liquid, and in the first treatment, he sealed them and then let the flask sit for a long time, and nothing really happened. The liquid stayed as it is, it did not turbid, showing that there was no microbial activity happening there. Then in the second case, he did not seal it. Even in that case, there was no microbial activity over here. In the third case, what he did was, he did the whole treatment, applied the heat, boiled the thing, got rid of the microbes, but then removed this neck and let it sit. Basically, let the liquid come in contact with air outside, and when that happened, after some time, the solution turned turbid, indicating that there was bacteria. And finally, this is the very interesting and important part of the experiment. What he did was, he took this flask and he tilted it. Now, what's the point of tilting? So, remember, whatever, once the air has been expelled, whatever, air is coming from outside, that is kind of settling in this swan neck part, this part, okay. So, he could see those precipitates. Now, as long as the flask sat like this, there was no bacteria present. But when he tilts it like this, and this liquid now comes in contact with whatever is over here, and then he tilts it back and lets it sit, then this turns turbid, suggesting that the bacteria is what is present over here, what is getting settled down in that swan neck part, and that is what is responsible for turning this thing turbid. Just the air, which is otherwise able to flow, that is not causing the turbidity. So, this was a very, very conclusive experiment, and Pasteur actually ended up very famously proclaiming that never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. And turned out that he was right. After this, nobody really took spontaneous generation seriously anymore. So, now that we are done with spontaneous generation, this led to the principle of what is known as biogenesis, that is, life only comes from pre-existing life. However, that leads to a logical problem. What is the problem? The problem is that if life only comes from pre-existing life, then at some point, life must have originated. Where did the first life come from? Okay, and that is something that people then started thinking about it. And one of the theories that at least some people put forward, I won't say that it was a very big theory, was the theory of panspermia. What is it? So, people thought that life originated elsewhere in the universe and was transmitted to Earth via meteorites, okay, comets and whatever asteroids or whatever other celestial bodies which came near Earth and fell on the Earth, they transported life. Now, frankly speaking, this is not a very scientific theory, because it is simply saying that, look, it didn't happen on Earth, it happened somewhere else, that is about it. It does not really talk about how life arose to begin with, right? And that is why nobody really took this theory very seriously, and although there are some books which do mention this stuff, the scientific community has more or less ignored this theory. Now, here I need to take a quick aside and tell you about something slightly different, which is very close to panspermia, but it is called pseudopanspermia. So, as I told you, Panspermia is not even a scientific theory. But pseudopanspermia is a very different ballgame. What is pseudopanspermia? It's a notion that different organic molecules, what do I mean by organic molecules? Molecules that contain carbon in them. Okay. So, different organic molecules were formed in the space and they have arrived on the earth via meteorites. Okay. Now, this actually is supported very strongly by the fact that organic molecules of what looks like extraterrestrial origin have indeed been found inside meteorites. Now, this is thought, it is thought that all these molecules, organic molecules, they might have taken some part in the formation of life on earth from non-living molecules. It simply says might, because it's not possible for us to prove that conclusively, as we are going to see in a minute, but at least we think that this happened. Why do we think this happened? Because if you look at the various meteorites that we find in different parts of the earth, many of them actually contain such molecules. And the most famous meteorite in this context is the so-called Murchison meteorite, which landed on earth on 28 September 1969 in Australia. Now, meteorites are nothing new, right? But the reason this one is important is because it arrived in recorded history and scientists were able to get hold of it very soon after its arrival, extremely soon actually. So, what they did was they essentially, this meteorite broke into many parts. So, it was collected from various parts of Australia, and I am showing you one piece of the meteorite. And this is one of the most well studied meteorites on the planet, and people have found that the silicon carbide grains that you find on this meteorite, they are 1 to 5 billion years older than the earth itself. So, their age is somewhere between 5.5 to 10 billion years, and the earth originated about 4.5 billion years ago, indicating that this is the oldest material found on the surface of the earth till date at least. However, more important than the silicon carbide is the fact that if you break open this meteor and take samples from the center of the meteor. Now, why is that important? Because remember, this has come and fallen on the earth, right? Therefore, anything that you get from the surface of the meteor can potentially be a earth contaminant. But if you are taking something from the very center of the meteor and you are obviously observing all precautions, then the chances of that being a contaminant are very less. There are other chemical signatures also, because of which people are reasonably sure that whatever they have observed on this meteorite, they are of indeed extraterrestrial origin, and people have seen that there are amino acids like glycine, alanine and glutamic acid, and nuclear bases, purines, pyrimidines, etc. And as I said, the chemical properties of these things suggest that these are most probably of extraterrestrial origin. Very important point to note, although this is the most famous example, this is absolutely not the only example. There are many other meteorites from which people have been able to recover what looks like organic molecules of extraterrestrial origin. So, unlike panspermia, pseudopanspermia is something for which we have very strong scientific evidence. Now, this brings us to the third and perhaps the most credible theory of origin of life, which is known as abiogenesis. What is that? It is the natural process by which life can arise from non-living matter. Now, obviously, this leads to the question that if you are saying that life is arising from non-living matter, then in what way is this different from spontaneous generation, which, as we said, has been thoroughly discredited. So, the major difference between abiogenesis and spontaneous generation is that in spontaneous generation, there is no mechanism by which life could have originated. We simply say that maggots come from rotting meat, this animal comes from whatever soil, that animal comes from bark, and so on and so forth, without any mention of a mechanism. And secondly, it assumes that life can and does originate repeatedly under normal circumstances. So, if you remember when we were talking about Lamarckism, Lamarck actually subscribed to this idea of origin of life. He essentially said that look, continuously life is originating and each lineage has travelled different lengths of time. On the other hand, what abiogenesis is saying is that look, life did arise from non-living chemical components, but that happened only on early earth, and this is not something that is happening every day. It is a very unique event, and it happened because there were certain very specific conditions that were met in the early earth. And what abiogenesis does is, theory of abiogenesis, it actually tries to provide the physicochemical mechanism based on our knowledge of physics and chemistry obviously, by which this origin of life happened. So, it is a very mechanistic theory as opposed to a simple observational hypothesis like spontaneous generation. Now, what do we have here? Like many things in evolution, Darwin was one of the people who thought about abiogenesis. So, he was very acutely aware of the point that whatever he was talking about, evolution through natural selection, presupposes that life exists, okay. And then essentially he was talking about what are the various properties or what are the various outcomes of various evolutionary forces acting on them. But he did realize that his theory is not talking about where life comes from, and he didn't talk about it in his book Origin of Species, but he did mention it in his correspondence, particularly with the famous scientist Joseph Dalton Hooker. So, I will just give you one sentence that Darwin wrote in a otherwise long letter. It is a very famous sentence, but it is a long sentence. So, what I will do is I will just break it up for you so that you can see what are the various thoughts that are packed in that one simple sentence that Darwin wrote. So, he says that, but if, and oh what a big if. Okay, this is a very famous quote, but if and oh what a big if. We could conceive in some warm little pond. Okay, so the first thing he thinks is that this is happening, life is originating most probably in water and not on dry land, with all sort of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present. Now, why is he mentioning these things? Because nitrogenous compounds, okay, phosphoric compounds, these are all known components of the biochemistry of living organisms, all living organisms, and you also need some kind of energy for these things to come together to form the various polymers that we have in our body. So, he is explicitly talking about the source or the potential sources and the fact that you need energy in that context. That a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed. Why? Because right now what we have is an oxidizing atmosphere. Okay, we have a huge amount of oxygen around us, and therefore any such early reaction which is happening out there in the wild without being encased inside a cell membrane, etc., all that is going to be subject to the forces of oxidation, chemical forces of oxidation. And that is why he says that at the present such a reaction would not have happened, but which would not have happened have been the case before living creatures were formed. So, just to read it all once one more time, but if and oh what a big if, we could conceive in some warm little pond with all sort of ammonia and phosphoric salts, light, heat, electricity present, that a protein compound was chemically formed, ready to undergo still more complex changes. At the present, such matter would be instantly devoured or absorbed, which would not have been the case before living creatures were formed. So, Darwin didn't really take this idea forward, but the people who took this idea forward was the very famous Russian biochemist Alexander Oparin and JBS Halden, who we have already met. So together, well, to be fair, it was Alexander Oparin who proposes the theory in rather elaborate form in his book in 1924. However, JBS Halden did not know about it, and he independently proposed a smaller version of that in 1929. When Halden was asked about it, he was very clear that it's Oparin who gets precedence. However, in the literature, this is known as the Oparin-Halden hypothesis, or also facetiously called the primordial soup theory. Why so? I'll talk about it in a minute. So what exactly did these two people propose? So it's a longish thing, but I'll just break it down into the salient points. So Oparin and Halden hypothesis says that the early Earth had a chemically reducing atmosphere. Okay, why do we need this? Because remember, as I told you, if you have oxygen, then it was thought that many of the reactions which now happen inside the cell would not have happened because of oxidation in the under natural conditions, under the atmosphere. So the early Earth had a chemically reducing atmosphere. This atmosphere, exposed to energy in various forms, okay, and what are the sources of energy? Lightning, solar radiation and volcanic heat, produced simple organic compounds. And what kind of compounds are you talking about? Monomers like amino acids, sugars, nucleotides, etc. These compounds accumulated to form a soup. Okay, so again, the whole idea was that this most probably would have happened in water. That's where the chemistry will probably work out. And I think the soup thing comes from Halden's imagination, and I think he was thinking about warm little pond of Darwin. So he was the one who introduced the soup concept, that all these various compounds will accumulate to form a soup, and that is not sufficient because then all these monomers are going to be very dilute. So you need some way of concentrating that, even if it is happening locally, it doesn't have to happen globally. So the concentration could have happened at places like shorelines and mud flats and oceanic vents, etc., etc. We'll talk about all these points later. And once this concentration happened, then there were further transformations, because of which more complex organic polymers were formed, and finally all this somehow came together to form life in the soup. And this soup is what Halden calls the primordial soup. Now obviously this was just a way of visualizing things, but somehow the primordial soup name stuck, and that's why this is also known as the primordial soup theory. Now as you can see that it is making a bunch of claims, and these claims were not really made in thin air. So Oparin in particular had lots of reasons to believe whatever he was saying, and obviously some parts of it were hypothetical, but some part of it was coming from his deep knowledge of biochemistry. So this hypothesis, as you can see, it gives a probable chain of events that ultimately leads to the formation of life on prebiotic Earth. So obviously the question is, does it really work that way? And over the last 100 years or so, every single component of this proposed chain have been investigated intensely, okay, both experimentally and theoretically. And although obviously this is happening billions of years ago, this is happening at a time when for which we don't even have fossil evidences, therefore we cannot really pinpoint the precise events that would have happened to get to life that as we know it today. However, right now we have excellent candidate mechanisms for every single stage that Oparin and Halden proposed. Now what are those mechanisms? How did we find them? What is the nature of the evidence, and how sure about about every step? All those things we are going to look at in our next discussion. See you then. Bye.